Welcome to another episode of Reading Together from Sea Harp Press. I'm Eugene Lunning, co-founder of Sea Harp, and I'm looking forward today to continuing our journey through C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. This is a HarperCollins hardcover edition of the book, not part of our Sea Harp catalog. Always want to remind you of that. Today, we're going to be in Book 1, Chapter 4, which the title of is What Lies Behind the Law? And just so you know, we've been talking for these last 3 chapters about what Lewis calls the law of nature, the law of human nature. I've often referred to it as natural law. Let's dive in. Let us sum up what we have reached so far. In the case of stones and trees and things of that sort, what we call the laws of nature may not be anything except a way of speaking. When you say that nature is governed by certain laws, this may only mean that nature does, in fact, behave in a certain way. The so-called laws may not be anything real, anything above and beyond the actual facts which we observe. But in the case of man, we saw that this will not do. The law of human nature, or of right and wrong, must be something above and beyond the actual facts of human behavior. In this case, besides the actual facts, you have something else. A real law which we did not invent and which we know we ought to obey. And after 3 chapters, moving into our 4th, what Lewis is about to be doing, and you have to remember these were originally broadcasts where he was reminding people during wartime England of the realities not only of human nature, but of God's sort of interpenetration into human nature by his work in Jesus and throughout human history. So what he's doing here is he's starting kind of grabbing the edge of the rug to get ready to pull it out from under us, that we have this perception of natural law. Well, what lies back of that? Because it's not just what we observe about human behavior. It appears to be sort of over and above it, sort of supra-mundane. It's beyond anything that we think about it, if I can be a little unclear. Let's keep reading. I now want to consider what this tells us about the universe we live in. Here we go. Ever since men were able to think, they have been wondering what this universe really is and how it came to be there. And very roughly, 2 views have been held. First, there is what is called the materialist view. People who take that view think that matter and space just happen to exist and always have existed, nobody knows why. And that the matter, behaving in certain fixed ways, has just happened by a sort of fluke to produce creatures like ourselves who are able to think. By one chance in 1,000, something hit our sun and made it produce the planets, and by another 1,000th chance, the chemicals necessary for life and the right temperature occurred on one of these planets. And so some of the matters on this earth came alive, and then by a very long series of chances, the living creatures developed into things like us. The other view is the religious view. And there's a footnote here that says, see note at end of this chapter. In fact, I'll flip over. We might as well take the journey that Lewis wants us to take. Well, there it is. I'll read this to you. This is his note that has to do with what he calls the religious view. Let's listen. In order to keep this section short enough when it was given on the air, I mentioned only the materialist view and the religious view. But to be complete, I ought to mention the in-between view called life force philosophy, or creative evolution, or emergent evolution. The wittiest expositions of it come in the works of Bernard Shaw, but the most profound ones in those of Bergson. People who hold this view say that the small variations by which life on this planet evolved from the lowest forms to man were not due to chance, but to the striving or purposiveness of a life force. That's a hard word to say. Say that 3 times. When people say this, we must ask them whether by life force they mean something with a mind or not. If they do, then a mind bringing life into existence and leading it to perfection is really a god, and their view is thus identical with the religious. If they do not, then what is the sense in saying that something without a mind strives or has purposes? This seems to me fatal to their view. One reason why many people find creative evolution so attractive is that it gives one much of the emotional comfort of believing in God and none of the less pleasant consequences. When you are feeling fit and the sun is shining and you do not want to believe that the whole universe is a mere mechanical dance of atoms, it is nice to be able to think of this great mysterious force rolling on through the centuries and carrying you on its crest. If, on the other hand, you want to do something rather shabby, the life force, being only a blind force with no morals and no mind, will never interfere with you like that troublesome God we learned about when we were children. The life force is a sort of tame God. You can switch it on when you want, but it will not bother you. All the thrills of religion and none of the cost. Is the life force the greatest achievement of wishful thinking the world has yet seen? Just to remind you, that was all an end note to this chapter, after what he has here, a little asterisk next to religious view. Now we're going to go back. In this edition, we're on page 22. I'll keep reading about the religious versus the materialist view. I'll keep going. According to it, the religious view, what is behind the universe is more like a mind than it is like anything else we know. That is to say, it is conscious and has purposes and prefers one thing to another. And on this view, it made the universe, partly for purposes we do not know, but partly, at any rate, in order to produce creatures like itself. I mean, like itself to the extent of having minds. Please do not think that one of these views was held a long time ago and that the other has gradually taken its place. Wherever there have been thinking men, both views turn up. And note this too. You cannot find out which view is the right one by science in the ordinary sense. Science works by experiments. It watches how things behave. Every scientific statement in the long run, however complicated it looks, really means something like, quote, I pointed the telescope to such and such a part of the sky at 2:20 a.m. on January 15th and saw so and so, unquote. Or, quote, I put some of this stuff in a pot and heated it to such and such a temperature and it did so and so, unquote. Do not think I am saying anything against science. I am only saying what its job is. And the more scientific a man is, the more, I believe, he would agree with me that this is the job of science, and a very useful and necessary job it is too. But why anything comes to be there at all, and whether there is anything behind the things science observes, something of a different kind, this is not a scientific question. If there is something behind, then either it will have to remain altogether unknown to men, or else make itself known in some different way. The statement that there is any such thing and the statement that there is no such thing are neither of them statements that science can make. And real scientists do not actually make them. It is usually the journalists and popular novelists who have picked up a few odds and ends of half-baked science from textbooks who go in for them. After all, it is really a matter of common sense. Supposing science ever became complete so that it knew every single thing in the whole universe, is it not plain that the questions, why is there a universe? Why does it go on as it does? Has it any meaning? Would remain just as they were? So friends, as Lewis has just said, this is not anti-science. And Lewis is very clear about the empirical method. We can only experiment with things that are to figure out things that might be, reactions, these sorts of things. But it is nearly impossible to actually go back past the idea of there even being matter and material and to actually get at these sort of root causes. I love that note, the idea of this life force that is purposeless, mindless. Well, that doesn't make any sense. And this idea of a life force that has a mind but is sort of this benevolent, non-speaking part, well, is a tame God, just as Lewis says. This reminds me, I've referenced this dear friend of mine before, but there's a particular philosopher who I am somewhat enamored with, and don't ask Jenny because she'll tell you I go on about this sometimes. Ludwig Wittgenstein. I've always been interested in Wittgenstein because here's this absolute genius who's completely obsessed with the logic of words and the way by which we actually sort of picture and give voice to reality using words. But I actually, of all his works, prefer his very first, the only one that was actually published in his lifetime, the Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. I love it because in it, I think somebody has told me that approximately 1/5 of it is actually just purely, let's call it sort of mystical. It's hard to even give word to what it is, because he gives these almost inexpressible statements of just being in awe that are completely glorious in the midst of a lot of stuff that frankly I don't understand. And towards the end, and I think this is where Lewis is taking us right now as he points at the empirical method, my friend Wittgenstein says, that which one cannot speak of, thereof one must be silent. This idea that in the place where God does things prior to our ability to even grasp and see or picture or experiment with, well, in some ways in that place we must be still, silent, realizing our smallness, and wait upon him. So as we look at the material, the religious, even that sort of life force method that Lewis was talking about, in all of it, when we look at first motive forces that got it all going, creation, sometimes it's good for us to feel that smallness, to realize there's nothing we can say about it, and just to say, wow, God, you are. I'll keep reading. Now, the position would be quite hopeless, but for this. There is one thing, and only one, in the whole universe which we know more about than we could learn from external observation. That one thing is man. We do not merely observe men, we are men. In this case, we have, so to speak, inside information. We are in the know. And because of that, we know that men find themselves under a moral law, which they did not make and cannot quite forget even when they try, and which they know they ought to obey. Notice the following point. Anyone studying man from the outside, as we study electricity or cabbages, not knowing our language and consequently not able to get any inside knowledge from us, but merely observing what we did, would never get the slightest evidence that we had this moral law. How could he? For his observations would only show what we did, and the moral law is about what we ought to do. In the same way, if there were anything above or behind the observed facts in the case of stones or the weather, we, by studying them from outside, could never hope to discover it. I love this idea of sort of this outside force looking in and seeing not what we ought to do, but what we actually do. This is sort of the empirical method writ across all humanity based upon pure observability, if I could put a tongue twister on it. But let's keep going. The position of the question then is like this. We want to know whether the universe simply happens to be what it is for no reason, or whether there is a power behind it that makes it what it is. Since that power, if it exists, would be not one of the observed facts, but a reality which makes them, no mere observation of the facts can find it. There is only one case in which we can know whether there is anything more, namely our own case. And in that one case, we find there is. Or put it the other way around. If there was a controlling power outside the universe, it could not show itself to us as one of the facts inside the universe. No more than the architect of a house could actually be a wall or staircase or fireplace in that house. The only way in which we could expect it to show itself would be inside ourselves, as an influence or a command trying to get us to behave in a certain way. And that is just what we do find inside ourselves. Surely this ought to arouse our suspicions. In the only case where you can expect to get an answer, the answer turns out to be yes. And in the other cases where you do not get an answer, you see why you do not. Suppose someone asked me, when I see a man in blue uniform going down the street, leaving little paper packets, at each house. Why, I suppose, that they contain letters. I should reply, because whenever he leaves a similar little packet for me, I find it does contain a letter. And if he then objected, but you've never seen all these letters which you think the other people are getting, I should say, of course not. And I shouldn't expect to, because they're not addressed to me. I'm explaining the packets I'm not allowed to open by the ones I am allowed to open. It is the same about this question. The only packet I am allowed to open is man. When I do, especially when I open that particular man called myself, I find that I do not exist on my own, that I am under a law, that somebody or something wants me to behave in a certain way. I do not, of course, think that if I should get inside a stone or a tree, I should find exactly the same thing, just as I do not think all the other people in the street get the same letters as I do. I should expect, for instance, to find that the stone had to obey the law of gravity, that whereas the sender of the letters merely tells me to obey the law of my human nature, he compels the stone to obey the laws of its stony nature. But I should expect to find that there was, so to speak, a sender of letters in both cases, a power behind the facts, a director, a guide. And I spoke to this either in our last episode or the one before, but I want to point out that there is a philosophical fallacy called a solipsism. This is the idea that I can only really know that which is true and I can perceive for myself. That's not what Lewis is doing here. What he is doing, and I actually love right here in the middle of page 25 in this edition, he actually capitalizes, I can open that particular man called myself. He capitalizes myself. And this is an important idea. It's the idea that to know oneself, to actually study both the negatives and positives, to pay attention to those fluid forces within us that are making us who we are, and that are in fact, and I do believe this to the depths of my being, drawing us in the direction of the one in whose image we've been made. When we study ourselves, yes, we're not studying the letters at the other people's doorsteps, but we are studying the exact example of humanity we've been given to study. So again, friends, this is not sort of secular humanism I'm encouraging you to do, but I am saying that to pay attention to the way that God whispers to us is to pay attention to the way that God whispers to humanity. His journey with you is illustrative of how he is trying to do this with everyone else. Do you see why it's so important to frankly wake up in the morning and be with him? To pay attention. To even at times, I say this to my friends, sort of rearrange the posture, yes, of our physicality, but also our spirit. Paying attention is opening ourselves Godward. It's allowing us to listen for the voice. And that voice, by the way, is the power, the director, the guide. Does that sound like something we should probably do with our given day? Yes. All right, last paragraph of this wonderful chapter. Do not think I am going faster than I really am. I am not yet within 100 miles of the God of Christian theology. All I have got to is a something, capital something, which is directing the universe and which appears in me as a law urging me to do right and making me feel responsible and uncomfortable when I do wrong. I think we have to assume it is more like a mind than it is like anything else we know. Because after all, the only other thing we know is matter, and you can hardly imagine a bit of matter giving instructions. But of course, it need not be very like a mind, still less like a person. In the next chapter, we shall see if we can find out anything more about it. But one word of warning. There has been a great deal of soft soap talked about God for the last 100 years. That is not what I am offering. You can cut all that out. So friends, as I close up this, which is chapter 4 of book 1 of Mere Christianity, What I find myself struck by is what I was just alluding to a moment ago. The idea that right now, you're watching me, having recorded this video on a day in my human life, you're watching this video on a day in your human life. And I always want to remind you, and this is one of my own life theologies, life philosophies, that today is the day when you are called to, and in fact privileged to, encounter God. To actually slow down, to change the rhythm of the course of this day so that you are paying attention to the fact that He actually loves and cares for you. You do not need to go through this day thinking that you're like this little mote floating in the atmosphere of nothingness. No! You are deeply loved. There is a director, a guide, who has not only knit you together in your mother's womb, but who has brought you right to this moment so that you might know Him, so that He might not just be this sort of whispering voice of conscience, but that He would begin to become a personal and personalized God of your heart. Friends, He made us. He wants us to know Him. He wants us to walk with Him intimately. Let's wake ourselves up and let's see what He has for us in this day of our human lives. Thanks for joining me. We have been in Mere Christianity. Again, that was Book 1, Chapter 4. I will look forward to our next chapter, and I always want to remind you, I'm so grateful that you would join me in these videos and take this journey with me. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.